The auctioneer held up one of the ewes by the loose skin over her shoulders so the whole ring could see how bad she looked, half her winter coat hanging off her in gray rags where she had started to shed, the bare pink hide showing through in patches down her sides, and he set it into the microphone so it carried out over the folding chairs and the cattle gate and the men leaning on it. That here was a sheep that grew no wool, that a man could shear her every spring of her life and never get enough off her back to stuff a pillow, and would somebody, anybody, give him $1 to take the whole raggedy bunch of them off the yard. He said it to a small, thin woman sitting 3 rows back in a faded olive barn coat, because she was the only person in the building who was not laughing. Her name was Myrta Colquitt, and she was 62 years old. She raised her card, which was a torn piece of a feed sack with a number penciled on it, and she said $4, and the auctioneer looked at her like she had sneezed. And then he sold her 71 head of hair sheep for $4 apiece before anybody in the ring could think of a reason to bid against a woman for something none of them wanted. She paid at the window in the small square hand of a person who had kept somebody else's records for a living, and she asked for a receipt, and the girl at the window had to go find a pen. 14 months later, on a Sunday in the middle of the wettest August that county had seen in 40 years, 3 of the men who laughed at her in that ring would drive up her muddy lane one at a time to ask her to sell them a ram, and one of them would sit in his truck at the top of her hill for an hour before he could make himself do it. But that afternoon the sale barn only laughed, and the ewes stood in the ring shedding their coats in ugly gray hanks, and every man there went home certain he had watched a woman throw $4 a head at a pen of sheep that were not even worth their hides. Understand what hair sheep are, because the whole story sits on it. Somewhere back down the long history of the thing, before anybody thought to breed a sheep for the coat on its back, a sheep grew hair like a deer or a goat. A short coat it shed on its own every spring when the weather turned, and it grew that coat to live and not to be sheared, and it lived in hot, wet country where the fancy wool sheep drowned in their own fleeces and died of worms in the belly and rot in the feet. Men bred the wool onto sheep the way men breed everything onto everything, on purpose for a market, and it was a good trade for thousands of years when a fleece was worth money and the labor to take it off was worth nothing. But the hair sheep never went away entirely. They hung on down in the hot bottoms and the coastal flats where nothing else would live, shedding their coats in the ditches every April, growing no wool at all, and asking for none of the shearing and the drenching and the crutching and the doctoring that a wool sheep asks for every week of its life. And Myrta Colquitt had been born and raised in the flat, wet country down along the Gulf, where her people ran hair sheep on the coastal grass for 4 generations, because a wool sheep put on that ground was a dead sheep by August. And she had spent the first 20 years of her life watching a hair sheep do, in the heat and the wet and the worms, what no wool sheep could do, which was simply to live. Then she had married a quiet man named Emmett Colquitt, and come north with him to the high-rolling sheep and cattle country of Colfax County, where every flock on every ridge was wool, where a man's worth was half measured in the size of his clip, and where for 31 years she had watched those wool flocks fight a war they were slowly losing and never once named the enemy right. She had done the doctoring for a big outfit up there for most of those years, hired on as the shepherd's wife, but really the one who kept the health book, and she had watched, year over year, the wormer stop working. That was the thing nobody up there would say plainly. There is a worm that lives in a sheep, a barber pole worm they call it for the candy stripe on it, and it lives in the 4th stomach and it drinks blood, and in the warm, wet part of the year it breeds in a sheep and lays its eggs out on the pasture in the manure and hatches into the grass and gets eaten again by the next sheep by the 1,000. And it will bleed a lamb white and drop it dead in a week. For a long time a man could pour a drench down a sheep's throat twice a year and kill the worm and go on. But a worm is a fast thing and a drench is a slow thing, and every time you drench a flock, you kill all the worms but the few that happen to be born able to shrug it off, and those few are the only ones that breed the next crop. And Myrta had sat with the health book on her knee for 31 years and watched the day come, on that big outfit, and then on every outfit in the county, when you could pour the drench down a sheep and the worm never even flinched. They bought a stronger drench. It worked for 3 years, and then it did not. They bought a third. There is no fourth. And the whole county went on shearing wool off sheep that were dying of a worm the county could no longer kill, and paying to have it done in a decade when the last wool buyer in 3 counties had quietly closed his warehouse, and the shearing you paid for produced a fleece that was worth, at the end, about the price of the gas to haul it to town. Emmett died 3 autumns back, sitting up in the truck in his own field with the engine running and the radio on, and Myrta buried him and kept the 80 acres they had bought on Draketown Road, 40 of it high and rolling and well-drained, and 40 of it low, creek bottom, that stood in water half the spring. She had run a few cattle on it and cleared about what a person clears running a few cattle, which is to say she had gone backward slowly in a dignified way, and she had spent 3 autumns doing the arithmetic on that at her kitchen table. Her mother, back down on the coast, had worn out a saying on her before she was grown, standing in the shed pens with a shedding ewe between her knees, which was that you can kill a worm, or you can breed a sheep the worm can't touch, and only one of those you have to do just once. And there was a man in Colfax County who wanted Myrta's 40 acres of high ground. Alton Pruitt ran the biggest wool flock on that end of the county, 1,100 ewes on the flat below her, and he had come to her 3 times since Emmett died, wanting to summer lease her ridge for his own sheep, and every time he came, he was decent about it, and every time the number went up. He would pay her cash rent to run his wool ewes on her high grass through the dry months and take them home in the fall, and she could sit on her porch and cash the check and never fool with a sheep herself again. And it was a fair offer. The fairest anybody was making anybody up there. The 3rd time he asked was the spring before the sale, standing in her lane with the truck running, and she told him no, and could not tell him why in any way he would accept, because the true reason was that she was not going to rent her clean high ground to be seated down with a worm that 1,100 wool sheep would leave in the grass. And there was no way to say that to a man whose whole life was those 1,100 sheep. He drove off deciding, kindly, that the widow had gotten strange and sentimental about Emmett's ground. She was not sentimental about the ground. She had kept the health book for 31 years, and she knew exactly what 1,100 wool sheep would do to a clean pasture, and she had a different plan for her 40 acres, and it was standing in a pen at the sale barn, shedding its coat in the dirt while a room full of men laughed at it. 6 of the 71 were down and would not get up by the time she got them home in a borrowed stock trailer, and 2 of those died in the yard the first night, weak and wormy and hauled too hard, and that put her at 69. And the first hard fact of her new life was that she stood in her own barn lot at 10 o'clock at night with a flashlight counting sheep that were mostly bald, in a coat she had worn to Emmett's funeral. Word of the count was in the diner by Tuesday. Hollis Teague, who had cried the sale, told it, and he told it well, with his hands, the way he told everything, how the Colquitt widow had paid actual money for sheep that were being given away, how 2 were dead before she got the trailer unhooked, and how the rest of them stood around in her lot looking like somebody had gone at them with hand shears and quit halfway. Alton Pruitt heard it at the corner table and shook his head and did not say much for a while, because Alton was not a cruel man, only a certain one. He was on the board at the wool pool and the county fair and the bank, and he was the man in that country whose opinion decided what an opinion was, and what he finally said was that Myrta had been out of the sheep business 2 years, and it had softened her judgment, and that a woman her age had no business starting a flock from the bottom of a sale ring, and everybody nodded. Because it was kind, and it was final, and it settled the thing. His son said the funnier line, the one that stuck. Cade Pruitt stood up at the counter and pulled his own shirt half off one shoulder and walked between the tables with his chest bare on one side, shivering and going bah, and after that they were not hair sheep anymore. They were the naked flock, and the whole county called them that before Myrta had owned them a week. The first morning she turned them out onto her high grass. In the second week of June, 69 hair sheep walked out of the barn onto a clean, rested pasture, and the first thing Myrta did, before she fed them, before anything, was catch every one of them through a chute she had built out of 2 gates and a stock panel, and pull down the lower lid of each sheep's eye with her thumb and look at the color of it. That was the whole of the thing nobody up there understood. A sheep dying of the barber pole worm is a sheep bled anemic from the inside, and the blood shows, or the lack of it does, in the membrane inside the lower eyelid, which runs from a good deep red in a healthy sheep to a paper white in a dying one, and there is a card with the colors printed on it that anybody can hold up and read, and it costs nothing, and Myrta had used it for years on the big outfit while the men laughed at her for peeling eyelids. She was not going to drench the whole flock and breed a worse worm. She was going to look at 69 pairs of eyes and drench only the handful that needed it, and write down the number on every sheep, and any ewe that showed up pale twice was going to the sale herself, no matter how pretty her lambs were. Because Myrta was not raising sheep, she was raising sheep the worm could not kill, and you do that by getting rid of the ones it can. She marked 11 that first morning. She drenched those 11 and turned the other 58 out untouched. She moved them every 3 days. That was the second thing, and the thing that looked to the county like a woman with too much time, that the widow on Draketown Road was out there shifting a single wire and a few step-in posts every 3rd morning, walking 69 bald sheep off a fresh piece of grass they had barely touched and onto another one. But the worm lives in the bottom 2 inches of the grass. It hatches in the manure, and it climbs up a wet blade of grass in the morning dew as high as it can go, which is not very high, and it waits there to be eaten, and it cannot climb back up if the sheep are gone, and it dies out there in a few weeks with nothing to eat it. So Myrta grazed the top half of the grass and left the bottom, and moved the flock before they grazed down into the worm, and never brought them back to that piece until the sun and the weeks had burned the worm out of it, and the ground behind them was never chewed to dirt. It was clipped high and rested. She kept them off the low 40. The bottom ground that stood in water half the spring, the ground Alton Pruitt would have run his ewes right through, Myrta fenced off entirely and never put a sheep on it in the wet. Because a sheep standing in soft wet dirt gets foot rot and foot scald, a stink that eats the foot out from under it, and a wool sheep in a wet county spends its life lame on rotten feet, and Myrta simply did not let it start. She kept her flock on the high dry ridge, and let the wet bottom grow up rank, and cut it for what winter hay she needed, and grazed her sheep on the tops of the hills where the wind kept the ground dry and the feet hard. And she did not shear them at all. That was the third thing, and the thing that made no sense to a single soul up there, that the woman with a flock of sheep never once called the shearing crew. A hair sheep sheds. Come April, it drops its winter coat in the fence lines and the brush and gray drifts and grows a slick, short summer hair, and there is nothing to shear, nothing to crutch, nothing to skirt, no soiled wool on the back end for a fly to lay its eggs in on a wet day, no lanolin-soaked fleece to hold the damp against the skin and rot. The county paid $1.50 a head to shear sheep and got back a fleece worth 40 cents, and Myrta paid nothing and had nothing to sell and did not want anything to sell, because the wool had never been the point of a sheep to her people. The point of a sheep was a lamb and a carcass, and a hair sheep gives you both off grass and asks for nothing on top. She did not do it alone. Silas Mott was 23 years old and swept the alleys and ran the scale at the sale barn for wages, and he had known Myrta since he was a boy, since she had patched his hand once when he cut it on a gate at a sale and nobody else looked up. He came out on a Saturday to help her build the chute, and he came back the next Saturday and the one after that, and she paid him in cash and dinner and never asked him why he kept coming. Because his father ran 200 wool ewes on rented ground below the Pruitt place, and everybody in the county knew how that was going. He learned the eyelid card in an afternoon and got quicker at it than she was. He built the water so the sheep could not stand in it and foul it, a trough on a gravel pad that drained downhill and stayed clean. He heard the naked flock talked about at the sale barn every week of that summer and never once carried a word of it back to her, which at 23 is harder than it sounds. And he was the one, lying in the grass one evening, watching a ewe graze the tops off the fescue and step over the coarse stems, who worked out loud that the sheep were doing on purpose what Myrta was making them do, eating high and leaving the bottom, and Myrta told him he had a head for it, and Silas said his father told him he had a head for nothing. And she let that sit and handed him his plate. She called the vet in July when a lamb scoured and went down, and Dr. Lena Pardue drove out with her boots already on and walked the whole flock in a slow ring for an hour and did not say much while she did it. What she found she gave to Myrta straight, standing at the tailgate. The flock was sound. The feet were hard and clean. The eyes on all but a few were a good deep red. The lambs that were on the ground were bright and growing. And in a county where she spent every summer week elbow deep in wormy anemic wool sheep with rotten feet, Dr. Pardue said this bald raggedy bunch was the healthiest flock of sheep she had put her hands on all year. And then she told Myrta the honest hard thing too, because she liked her, which was that healthy did not mean rich, that there was no wool check coming, that the sale barn discounted a hair lamb because the buyers up here did not know what they were, and that the smart money in this county, whatever their feet looked like, was still wool. Myrta asked her one question. She asked whether the buyers down on the coast knew what a hair lamb was, and Dr. Pardue stood there a second and said that down there they knew exactly what one was, and paid a premium for it, because it was the only sheep that lived, and Myrta said that suited her, since she had not bought them to sell up here. She came through that first year better than the county wanted to believe, and worse than she made it look. The coyotes took 2 lambs out of the timber corner in September, and she moved the flock up onto the open ridge and penned them tight at night after that, every night, without one miss for the rest of her life. Because a sheep is a supper that walks up to you. 4 grown ewes she culled herself in October, the ones that showed pale on the eyelid card twice, hauled them to the sale no matter that 2 of them had raised the best lambs on the place, because a ewe the worm can touch is a ewe that breeds you a flock the worm can touch, and Myrta was building the other thing. She came into the winter with 63 head and about 40 lambs, and she wintered them on the hay off her own wet bottom and about a quarter pound a head a day of grain in the coldest 6 weeks, and nothing else. No drench, no shearing, no vet, but the 1 lamb, and she wrote every bit of it down in the health book in the same square hand she had kept for 31 years. And the book was the whole point. Here is what was in the book by the end of that first winter, and here is why she kept it. 63 ewes and 40 lambs had come through from June to March, and she had spent, all in, on the whole flock, 1 bottle of drench, a few sacks of grain, and the hay off her own wet bottom that cost her nothing but the diesel to cut it. She had not paid a shearing crew $1. She had not paid the vet but the once. She had not bought a heat lamp or a lambing jug or a bag of milk replacer or a single thing a wool flock swallows money on between one Christmas and the next. And she knew, because she had kept the health book on the big outfit for 31 years, exactly what 1,100 wool ewes cost Alton Pruitt to carry over the same winter. The shearing and the drenching that no longer worked, and the doctoring and the grain and the lambing barn lit up all night in March. And she knew that a man who does not charge himself for the nights he does not sleep is not keeping books. He is telling himself a story. She did not say any of that to a living soul. She wrote it down in the square hand, and she turned the page. In the middle of March, her ewes started to lamb out on the grass in the cold, clear mornings, and Myrta pulled on her boots and walked out, expecting the thing she had watched wool flocks do every spring of her married life, which is to lamb in a barn under a heat lamp with a man up all night pulling lambs and warming lambs and losing lambs. And instead, she watched a hair ewe walk off to the fence line by herself, lie down, have a lamb, stand up, clean it, and have it dry and sucking and following her across the grass inside of an hour, and then do it again with a twin, and she watched 63 ewes do very nearly that same thing across 3 weeks and lose almost none of it. Because a hare sheep down all those generations that a man was not there to help it had bred itself to lamb on grass and get up and go, and Myrta stood at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee and watched 110 lambs come onto her ridge that spring, out of a flock the whole county called naked, and not one of them had cost her a night's sleep in a barn. She sold her first ram lambs that June, and it was a small thing, and it was the turn. A man drove up from 2 counties south, a hair-sheep man from the edge of the wet country who had heard there was a bald flock up in Colfax nobody wanted, and he bought 8 ram lambs off her at $90 a head to breed the shedding and the worm resistance into his own flock, and he told her, standing at her gate, counting out the money, that a proven resistant ram out of clean high country was worth 5 of anything he could buy at home, and that she was sitting on the one thing everybody in the wet South was hunting for. $920 for 8 lambs the sale barn would have knocked down at 30. Cade Pruitt was in the diner when the check got mentioned and said the widow had finally found a fool who liked bald sheep and got his laugh, but Alton Pruitt did not join in that time, because Alton had spent that spring pouring his 3rd drench down 1,100 ewes and watching the worm come back inside of a month, and he had begun, very quietly, to be tired. Then it rained. It began the first week of May, and it did not stop. Not the way a wet spring stops, giving you a dry stretch to get the hay up, but on and on, a rain every 3rd or 4th day from May clear through August, the wettest year that county had seen in 40 years. And every farmer in Colfax stood at a window watching water stand in ground that had never stood in water, and knew by June that something had gotten loose. It was the worm. The barber pole worm breeds in the warm and the wet the way a fire breeds in dry grass, and a summer that never dried out and never cooled off was the summer that worm had been waiting 100 years for, and it came up out of every wet pasture in the county by the million, and climbed the wet grass in the morning and got eaten. And by the middle of July the wool flocks of Colfax County were dying on their feet. A man would drench, and it did nothing, because the drench had quit working years back, and he had been getting by on dry weather without knowing it. The sheep went pale, and then they went down, the good ones and the bad ones, the lambs first, and then the ewes, bled white from the inside by a worm no bottle in the county could touch, and the wet did the rest of it. The wool held the rain against the skin, and the fleeces rotted on the sheep's backs, and the flies found the soiled wool on the back ends and struck it, laid their eggs in the damp wool, and the maggots went to work on the living sheep, a thing the old men only half remembered and the young ones had never seen. And the standing water in every low pasture ate the feet out from under the flocks until whole bunches of them were down on their knees to graze. And the shearing crews would not come into wet sheep, and when they finally did, the wool came off rotten and stinking, and there was no buyer for it at any price, because the last warehouse had closed 2 years back, so a man paid $1.50 a head to have a rotten fleece pulled off a dying sheep and hauled to the dump. The word total started getting used at the corner table in a flat voice by men who had never used it about their own flocks. Now understand what that did, because the rain is not the story. The rain is only the bill coming due. A whole county's wealth was in wool sheep, and a wool sheep in a wet county with a worm you cannot kill is not an asset. It is a debt with a pulse. And in the last 2 weeks of July and the first weeks of August, the flocks of Colfax County went to the sale barn the way things go when a man has to. Whole bunches of ewes sold for the price of the trucking, lambs that never made weight sold as bottle-weight culls, and Hollis Teague cried sale after sale of goodwill flocks going out from under men whose fathers had built them. And it was nobody's fault, and it was everybody's, and there was not one particle of malice left in the county, only water and worms and the arithmetic finally coming true. And up on the high dry ridge on Draketown Road, the naked flock did not know anything had happened. Myrta's sheep grew no wool to rot and no soiled fleece for a fly to strike. Her sheep stood on the high hard ground where the water ran off and their feet stayed sound. Her sheep had been bred 2 years, running out of only the ewes the worm could not touch, and moved every 3 days ahead of the worm they carried. And I checked one at a time, so she knew every animal on the place. And in the worst worm summer in 40 years, Myrta Colquitt drenched across her whole flock 9 sheep and lost 3 lambs, and her ewes raised 130 fat lambs on grass, while the wool flocks below her died in the mud. Cade Pruitt saw it first, and he saw it from the road. His father had sent him up the ridge in the first week of August to look at a hay meadow, and he stopped his truck at the top of Myrta's lane and sat there with the engine running for a long time, because from that spot you could see both things at once. Below him, spread across the flat, his own family's wool flock stood thin and pale and lame in a pasture standing in water. Ewes down on their knees, dead sheep flagged for the truck, 100 years of the best wool breeding in the county rotting in the wet. Above him, on the other side of one fence, 60-some hair ewes and 130 slick fat lambs moved across a green-clipped ridge in the sun, sound on their feet, bright in the eye, shedding the last of their coats in the brush, eating same rain, same worm, same county. He did not say anything to anybody about it for a long while. Dr. Pardue said hers first, because she was the one driving from dying flock to dying flock all that August with nothing in her bag that worked, and she stopped at Myrta's on a Thursday to do the health papers on a load of breeding stock going south, and she leaned on the tailgate and said it plain. She said she had spent the whole summer watching sheep she could not save, and that she had told Myrta a year ago that the smart money was wool, and that she had been wrong, and that the 4 ewes Myrta culled for a pale eyelid the fall before were the grandmothers of the only healthy lambs left standing in the county, and she wanted that written in the book. Alton Pruitt took until the last Sunday in August. He was a good man, and he had been wrong for 14 months, and both of those stayed true the whole time, and it cost him more to drive up that lane than it cost any of them. He had sold 2/3 of his ewes at a loss he did not say out loud, and the 1/3 he kept were thin, and he did not know if they would breed. And he sat in his truck at the top of her hill for the better part of an hour before he came down, and Myrta let him sit, because she had seen him coming, and she was not going to make it easy or hard, only quiet. He stood in her lot with his hands in his pockets and told her he had come to ask her something and that he would take it kindly if she did not enjoy it too much. And Myrta told him she was 63 now and too tired to enjoy anything that took 14 months. What he wanted was rams. He wanted to buy her hair rams and cross them on to what wool ewes he had left, to breed the shedding coat and the hard feet and above all the resistance to the worm into a flock that the worm had just finished teaching him it could kill any time it got a wet year. And he stood there and said the thing that cost him the most, which was that he had watched her from that same corner table for a year, calling her sheep the naked flock along with everybody else, and that he had been the man in the county whose job it was to know better and had not. She sold him rams. She sold him 6 of her best ram lambs at a fair price and not $1 over it, and she would not take his money for the other thing he needed, which was to know how she had done it, and she spent an afternoon walking his rotten wet flock with him and telling him what to change, get the sheep up out of the bottoms, quit the blanket drench that was breeding the worm he could not kill, learn the eyelid card, move them ahead of the grass, and put the low creek ground he had run sheep on for 30 years back into something a sheep did not have to stand in the water to eat. He did most of it that next year and the year after, and his flock came back slower than he wanted and surer than he had any right to, half hair blood in it now, and the worm never got a grip on him like that again. Silas Mott quit the sale barn that fall. He took 40 hair ewes off Myrta on a handshake and a note he paid down over 3 years, and he put them on the rented ground his father had nearly lost, and Myrta drove down in the spring to look at them and stood at the fence a while and told him he had done it right, and the young man had to go check on something in the barn for a minute. She sold 240 breeding animals over the next 2 springs, ewes and rams both, to 50-odd farms in 4 counties and clear down into the wet South where they came from, and every animal went out the lane with a page she had typed herself and run off at the library, and the page said what to do, and more to the point, what not to do. Do not drench the whole flock. Read the eye, not the calendar. Move them ahead of the worm. Keep them up out of the wet. Cull the ones the worm can touch and never breed them, no matter how good the lamb. And at the bottom of the page, the one line on it that was not an instruction was the thing her mother used to say in the shed pens on the coast with a shedding ewe between her knees, which was that you can kill a worm or you can breed a sheep the worm can't touch, and only one of those you have to do just once. The original flock never left the ridge. That was the part the county came to like best, that Myrta Colquitt never sold one head out of the 71 she bought at $4 in that sale ring. Not one, not ever. 69 of them, and then fewer, lived out their lives on the high ground on Draketown Road, shedding their coats in the fence lines every April, lambing on the grass every March, going into the pen at dark every night of the world, and dying old the way an animal ought to. They were never worth a fleece, and never would be, and every one of them looked in April like something half-sheared and left, and Myrta did not care. Because the whole county was breeding out of their sons now, and there were slick soundworm-proof sheep on 50 farms in 4 counties that had come off a ridge, and every one of them traced back to a pen of bald ewes a room full of men had, laughed at. Hollis Teague, who cried that first sale, went on crying sales, because somebody has to, and he told the story on himself for years, and told it better every time. He would set it up with the ewe held up by the shoulders and the gray coat hanging off her, and his own voice saying grows no wool. Would somebody give me $1? And then he would let it sit. And then he would land it, that he had sold a woman 71 problems for $4 a head, and stood at his own microphone and helped the whole county laugh at her, and had watched her turn every one of those problems into the only sheep left standing in the wettest year any of them ever saw, and had not understood a single thing he was looking at. If you have stayed with her this far, you already know this was never about a sheep. Myrta Colquitt is the reason there is a hair sheep on nearly every place in that end of the county now, and she never made a speech about it, and she never once said I told you so to a man who had laughed at her, and to the day she quit driving, she would tell you flat that she had not been smart. She had only been raised in wet country where the truth about sheep was plain, and had spent 31 years watching men fight a worm with a bottle instead of with the sheep. She was laughed at for 14 months by good men who were not being cruel, only certain, and she was proven right in one wet summer by a rain that did not care about any of them. And in between she did nothing but read the eye, move the wire, keep them dry, cull the weak ones, and shut the pen at dark every single night. That is all competence ever is. It is the small right thing, done on the day it is due, for 14 months, while people who like you laugh. So, tell me which one you would have been that afternoon in the sale ring. There were only 2 kinds of people on those folding chairs, and neither kind was a bad person. The ones who looked at 71 bald sheep and saw 71 worthless hides, and the one who looked at the same sheep and saw the only animal in the county the worm could not kill. Be honest about it. Most of us are the first kind, and the first kind is not stupid. It is only certain, and certain is the most expensive thing a person can be. Write down in the comments which one you were, and tell me what part of the country you are reading this from, because I read every one of them, and I like knowing where you all are sitting tonight. Next time, I want to tell you about the man on the far side of that same county who planted a field of the one thing his neighbors swore no sane person would put in the ground, and what those same neighbors did the autumn they found out why. And if this one got to you, send it to somebody who has been told that the thing they have, or the thing they are, is not worth the trouble. Up on the ridge on Draketown Road, an hour before dark, a small gray-headed woman in a faded olive coat walks out to the gate with a bucket she does not really need, and a flock of slick worm-proof sheep comes up the green hill behind her in a long line, and she holds the pen door open and she counts them in.